what I've observed is that it seems like for them, they don't want to acknowledge certain things for fear that it may be perceived as legitimizing Israel, like all of Israel's actions. So like the sexual violence on October 7th is like a really good example. Like in my mind, it should not be mutually exclusive to just unequivocally condemn that sort of just wanton.
Well, the answer to that is that what lefties do is that, you know, they'll act a lot like MAGA, right? Where if there's any kind of if it's anything but unequivocal and uncritical support for, you know, whoever they're surrounding around, whether it's Donald Trump or it's not Donald Trump, what will happen is that they will view it as it's a loyalty test, right? Like lefties view this kind of stuff like a loyalty test, and that's like one of the best ways to describe things, right? It's a cult. That's what it is, right? This is cult behavior. Like it literally is cult behavior. If there's any kind of like for these liberal people, right? Like their communities are like, they think for themselves, right? They think a little bit more for themselves, more than other communities, like I would dare say. Like maybe it's a little bit pretentious for me to say, but like it really is true, because when you make your basis of information around facts and studies and stuff, it's just simply way better and way more knowledgeable and it's just more intelligent, right? Compared to a community that just goes off of how loyal you can prove you know, your support for the Palestinian people by glazing Hamas, right? Like this kind of thing happens all the time.
Like
Like everything is a purity test, right? It's all about purity testing. It's not about, you know, real action or, you know, actually making a change or something. It's just purity test. Yeah.
barbarism, and also at the same time say that Palestinians deserve the right of self-determination. They should have their own state. The blockade should ideally be ended. And like these things are not mutually exclusive, but they treat it like it is. Or, you know, if you get into the reason why the blockade happened, like it's not necessarily a defense of maintaining a blockade for 2 decades. But when you look at like why it happened in the first place, it kind of makes sense. Like I looked at the amount of suicide bombings that happened like by year, and I think it's in like was it 2003 or 2004? When was the second?
Also, you can argue the downside is that it's harder to unite the left than the cultist right. Well, yeah, well, that's true. There are lots of cult-like aspects on the left, but specifically only the far left, right? Though to be, you know, again, like, you know, they're not exempt from the blame. You know, there's a lot of liberal wine moms that are very cringe, I'm sure, right? Like they're not exempt.
Intifada, was that 2004?
2000, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah.
Well, sometime there was one particular year that it went from the previous year, there were like 2 suicide bombings in Israel proper, or greater Israel. And then the next year it was like fucking dozens.
Yeah, that's like 2001-ish, yeah.
Right. And then that number went back to like almost like none, or many of the years it was no suicide bombings after the blockade.
The game frozen.
So you can argue that Israel had a legitimate basis for security concerns at that time. Yeah. And that imposing the blockade was a rational decision. And at the same time, you can argue that Netanyahu himself was an avowed obstacle to a 2-state solution. And he was, you know, arguably more of a hindrance to the peace process than Hamas. But these people, I feel like they can't keep those 2 thoughts in their heads at the same time. It has to be like this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. And to a certain degree, they're right? Like there's the asymmetry is obviously on full display, but the nuance, their capacity for nuance just seems to have been like utterly annihilated since the start of this conflict.
Yeah, although it's like, to me, I don't really see it that much as like, I think most people are more internally consistent than
the capacity for nuance never really existed. Like, well, I guess the capacity of nuance, actually, no, I would like to correct what I said. The capacity for nuance has always existed, but it's more like where the scale for your nuance is, right? Because for us liberals, we argue where the nuance is like policies, right? We're trying to nuance out like which policies are the best. But for lefties, their nuance is in theory. Their nuance is in, oh, read theory. Oh, which liberal, which theory, which parts of theory are you going to be arguing for? The like for all the liberal policy stuff, that stuff is too far right for them. That stuff is too like, oh, complacent to fascism or whatever they want to call it, right? So we both nuance out things, but it's like yeah, you get it.
We think they are because when it comes to Israel Palestine, like it's not really like an illogical thing I see from them. I mean, it obviously does appear that way, but I think it's because for a lot of people, it's like it's not really a battle of like prescriptive positions or did this factual thing happen or not. Like to them, it's a battle of narratives. You know, it's like pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. The way that these people use it means all, right? Because like really, if you're sensible, you should be pro both. Even if you want one state, you should probably want Israelis and Palestinians both to have a level of like sovereignty or autonomy because they want different societies, even if they share the same country, right? Like even in a federalized system or something like that. So to me, it's a battle of narratives, but that also happens within the conflict as well, right? Because the conflict itself is like there are entrenched narratives on either side that no one really wants to cede because they feel like if they cede anything, then they're undermining their own side and their own cause. The problem is that there's nothing about Israel-Palestine that falls neatly into standard like binaries. Like it doesn't fall neatly into east or west.
Yeah.
It doesn't fall neatly into like brown versus white. It doesn't fall neatly into oppressor versus oppressed even. I can go into that if you want. Yeah, it doesn't fall into any of these. But people really want to squeeze it into one of those. And that's where you just end up like you have to just adopt a narrative that doesn't make any sense in relation to the reality.
Yeah, I think like one of the most I think common narratives is that Hamas, we can describe them as imperfect resistance, but they are legitimate resistance, like liberation movement, and therefore like it would be, what's the word I'm looking for? Very like biased towards the West to condemn them for like acts of terrorism, for example.
I think the bullet that they bite down should be this. Okay, I actually think this is the bullet that everyone should be biting down, especially if you want to argue for the pro-Palestinian, not the pro-Palestinian side, but like just going against these pro-Pali lefties. Okay, you should say, I would actually support Hamas if it weren't for the fact that they are like not actually pro-Palestinian, right? I would support Hamas if they actually did anything useful. I would support Hamas if they weren't like actually trying to maximize Palestinian death above all else, right? For their propaganda and to try to amass as much wealth as possible on off-sea, like Qatar, like fucking cities, right? If that makes sense. Like, why the fuck would, like, yeah, there's just no point. There's just no point.
Which is it's another one of those things that I feel like, and so once you establish that narrative, you need
like if you support the PLA, at least you're supporting something that isn't entirely like a terrorist group, right? Like the PLA, the Palestinian Authority, like I don't think they're purely a fucking terrorist group. Like at least they aren't like that, right? But I guess the problem here is like, again, it's just, people perceive any kind of nuance as a form of weakness.
You need to like legitimize that narrative through historical references. And so I know you're familiar with this, but they bring up like Nelson Mandela a lot.
It makes me worried with Trump getting that jet. Yeah, I think people begin to realize. I think people really begin to realize that as long as you glaze Trump and you give Trump anything, everything is passable for in terms of like getting anything you want out of them, right? Like for example, I'm pretty sure Putin got like one of the finest artists in Russia to paint a mural of Trump, right? Like, isn't that what he did? So if he did something like that and got his support that way, why can't other countries do the same?
And they bring up like the ANC in South Africa. And this to me is a very problematic comparison. And I would love to get into it with you more, because I'm sure you're just much more capable of kind of diving into the minutia there. But like the ANC, for example, like they were basically Marxists. They weren't like avowed Marxists, but they had aligned themselves with Marxist organizations all over the world for decades, including the PLO. Hamas are a group of religious extremists who declare as their goal the complete usurpation of the entire, from the river to the sea, through Islamic law, and then rule over that with Islamic law. I mean, they talked about
I want more Cameron slot food shop. Go watch someone else then. All right, I'm not gonna be the one to offer it to you. I'm sorry. Like that stuff is less interesting than, you know, this kind of stuff. Cover more? No. Listen, there's plenty of other people who cover that stuff. Okay.
I know Bad Empanada did a video where he's talking about you. He mentioned me very briefly, discussing Nelson Mandela. And it seems like these, in service of their narrative, that like Hamas is in perfect resistance, but we have to support them because they're a liberation movement, and they're like ANC, right? So they do this comparison, but Mandela wasn't exactly unclear about how he felt about terrorism. You can't find a single quote from him endorsing like full-on terrorism. And it's true that you had certain people within ANC who were granted amnesty during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And some people, there was one guy in particular, I think his name was McBride. He did this bombing. He had targeted a bar because he thought that it was a hotspot for like off-duty. What were the security? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
He thought it was like air like pilots or something. Yeah.
And he ended up killing like
officials. Yeah.
He ended up killing like 20 civilians. Like, I don't even think a single military target was killed during that strike. He was put on trial for that and found guilty and sentenced to death, but was granted amnesty through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because at the time they were just saying like anybody who did political violence up to a certain standard or whatever could come forward, just account for what they did.
Oh my God, Jesus Christ. Oh my gosh, people are so kind tonight. Holy shit. Oh, dude, Excliptor, thank you so much for the tier 3 sub, buddy. Thank you so much. That's mighty kind of you. Thank you. You guys help make this possible, so thank you so much for your support. I appreciate you guys. All right. I always look forward to chill streams, you know, just looking at stuff like this. Or not chill moments where I just start screaming at people, so, you know, like, it's really a coin flip sometimes, okay?
And they were basically granted for forgiveness at the time.
Yeah.
But
it's not even that. It's like within the conflict as well, when apartheid was still standing in the mid 80s, but 10 years before it collapsed, when those deaths were happening and when those attacks were taking place, where there was like the Church Street bombing as well, which was just like horrible intel, where they thought that there was like, I think it was something, I think it was the Air Force they were going after, but yeah, they killed civilians. Or like the land mining, which they had intended to use against like personnel carriers and tanks. I think they had to call that off after 2 years because like 22 people died and 21 of them were civilians, right? So, but the difference is that when those civilians were dying, within the conflict still ongoing, the ANC said, we don't want to kill civilians. We're trying to avoid civilian casualties. And they
By the way, the reason, okay, see, this is the biggest difference probably between the ANC and Hamas, okay? Like, you can't compare the ANC to Hamas or to the Houthis, because Houthi and Hamas, they benefit directly off of killing more people. The more people that they kill, the more their movement looks good to their radical supporters, because their radical supporters cheer whenever more people are dead. That is the biggest difference, all right? But obviously, the biggest difference with the ANC is that they're trying to get legitimacy in South Africa. What they're trying to gain is legitimacy, all right? Their support comes from the fact that they want people to empathize with them and to understand that the situation they are in is incredibly shitty and warrants improvement. And they're just human beings that are the same as anyone else, really. However, Hamas and the Houthis, they don't try to actually make that connection, okay? They don't want legitimacy on the world stage. They want legitimacy through fear, which isn't real legitimacy. That is terrorism, okay? If you want legitimacy through fear, that is terrorism, all right? And in fact, that's one of the better definitions of terrorism, right? If you want to gain more legitimacy by spreading as much fear, terror, and destruction, because that goes directly from the word itself. We're not like trying to bend the definition to any kind of weird gimmicks or anything like that, right? If you try to gain more support and legitimacy through fear and destruction and death, you are a terrorist, okay? Yeah. However, the reason why, like people say, oh, the ANC was put on the American terrorist watch list. Oh, they're labeled as terrorists too by the United States. Well, I would argue that that's, maybe legally they want to label that as like a terrorist, but I would argue that that's not a good labeling of terrorist whatsoever. I think that, obviously the ANC, when they're trying to gain legitimacy through majority peaceful means, right, and violence only when necessary, right, but they're not going full on with it, right, they're not hitting the full gen, as Hassan would say, right, obviously, it's just the way better. Listen, dude, don't we all want some peace and love? Don't we all want some peace and love? Like, you take any kind of ANC speaker and you look at one of their speeches versus what Hamas says, it's completely different. When was the last time you've seen an ANC speaker say, we have to destroy the Caucasian entity? Seriously, ask yourself this, okay? Ask anyone who disagrees with you on this, okay? When was the last time you ever heard an ANC speaker say, we have to destroy the Caucasian entity? Because the reason is because Hamas loves talking about how much they want to destroy the Zionist entity, the Zionist state, right? If you ever catch any kind of ANC person saying, I want to destroy the Caucasian state, oh, well, good luck trying to find that. And if they do say that, well, that's certainly not the party's main message whatsoever. Like, it's not even close, right? Like, what is Nelson saying that? What is Nelson saying there, right? I'm not necessarily opposed to that. Oh, please. Our peace and love is here in this chat. Yeah, honestly, like, here's the thing, okay? Maybe this sounds incredibly soy to say, okay? But isn't it just better to spread some peace and love? I don't know.
A few people lost their positions. They were demoted. There was like a rearrangement.
Sorry.
They literally dispatched all the fucking commanders to all the different units, and all in exile. They did this, by the way, to remind people of what their ethics were and like what was a legitimate target and what wasn't. Because unfortunately, disciplining people when you're a leadership in exile is very difficult. But they tried anyway, and they did this when, like, 1 year, I think 70 people died, mostly civilian, and that's too much. We need to like rein this in, and they did. It's ironic that Baden Panada would try to like claim that as something that would support his position, because if you pushed him, he hates the ANC. Really, he thinks he would be the kind of person that said like they compromised too much by allowing the whites to stay. He wants an Algerian solution, not a South African one. So that's but
he also ran cover for Mandela, like on a couple different points that I thought were very dubious points that he made. So the first one he made was,
oh no!
Obviously, like, you and me will cite.
Okay, thank God. Okay, that was weird. I couldn't. It was just really laggy on the other screen, I guess. Yeah, but I think we need to return. Listen, we need to return to empathy. Okay.
The speech that he gave during his trial, where he very, very explicitly, very clearly lays out his logic, his reasoning for why they didn't want to do terrorism. So there were 4 different types of violence, right? There was like sabotage.
Yep.
Terrorism, and then like revolution, like war, right? And his thinking was, if we did, he wasn't even in my mind when I read that letter and I read the whole transcript. He wasn't even necessarily making a moral argument against terrorism. He was coming at it more from a practical perspective. He was saying that if we do terrorism, it's going to make our goal of reunification difficult. If the country spirals into out and out civil war, then we are moving away.
Some people are still learning empathy. Yeah, sure. True. Although, to be fair, when I'm talking about empathy, I'm talking about real empathy, okay? None of that gay retarded shit where you virtue signal, okay? If you're genuinely trying to learn how to be a more empathetic person, don't say to other people that, like in public, like don't use it as a bragging point in public, okay? Because that's one of the most unempathetic things. Real empathy is not when you're weaponizing it against other people. Real empathy is being cognizant of the biases that you have, and is being cognizant of all the thoughts and you know beliefs that you have when you're making takes or giving opinions, right? That is real empathy, not the fake shit that like iDubbbz gives, okay? It's being cognizant of your biases. You don't have to get rid of your biases. You just have to be cognizant.
Away from our goal. So he was just attacking it from a very like practical perspective. But Bad Empanada was saying that he was only saying that because he was on trial and he was trying to avoid the death penalty. But if you look at his rhetoric throughout,
no, sir,
like
no.
you know, you can find quotes from his. Obviously, he became like way more anti-violence towards the end of his life after they had sort of like already accomplished that goal. But you just straight up cannot find any quotes of him saying that violence against civilians was acceptable.
That?
And when you point that out online, or when I pointed that out online, I had so many people coming in my mentions posting quotes of Mandela saying that violence could at some point become
Half-stricken empathy, argue with a cop very superficially about getting pulled over and then say forgive me. Well, I'm not saying that, right? Like I'm like obviously, you know, again, right? You're not trying to. Okay, do you know what fake empathy is? Fake empathy is when you go, oh, that person killed like 50 people. Well, listen, we have to forgive them now because we have to practice empathy. No, real empathy is, oh, that person killed 50 people. They have to suffer the consequences. However, like I want to actually dig into their background and see why the fuck they did that, or to see what kind of background they came from, and to see if we can rehabilitate them, right? That's real empathy. Yeah.
necessary, and in fact have become necessary in their struggle against apartheid. But they're just completely.
There's violence and there's being Gandhi. That's the only binary. Yeah,
right.
It's stupid. Yeah, it doesn't make any fucking sense. Yeah, Mandela wasn't saying that to avoid.
Yeah, empathy is not forgiveness. Forgiveness is an action. Empathy is a feeling. Okay. Sorry, empathy is also an action that you should work on. Yes.
Death penalty. Mandela said that because that's what they were doing. Things did escalate after the 60s. So in the 70s and 80s, the ANC would occasionally target military and police personnel. They did do that, although most of that was outside of South Africa, like in Rhodesia. It was still, I think the South African police at the end of the conflict logged like 1,500 ANC operations, right? And 250 people died. So even at the peak of it, they were still mostly targeting infrastructure, mostly. So yeah, the fact that they escalated towards killing police officers and security officials, like and military, but they never targeted civilians as a matter of policy. That's the difference. Just because some fires did, and when they did, that was dealt with.
Yeah, because targeting civilians and punishing civilians for opposing you is a one-track mind to the most to take away legitimacy on the world stage, right? The more sympathy you get from international, sources in terms of your peacemaking, the more that the more you might actually win, right? Yeah, like how else would a lot of people be able to defeat tyranny with peace, right? I mean, it sounds kind of like a contradiction, right? How do you topple entire empires by being peaceful, right? Well, slowly, slowly, with patience, with kindness, right? And with time. On this George Floyd anniversary or whatever, he's in the news, you can have more fucked up basic intuition to preserve self more. Really? Wait, what? Anissa? I think purely it's all Anissa. I've been in these relationships and going in hardcore, so it makes sense now. Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry.
They didn't have much of an infrastructure to jail them or anything, but they literally did like a whole reining in, and this was public. I can show you an article from the New York Times in 1987 when the ANC are like publicly announcing that they're doing this and that they don't want civilians to get hit. So you can, and then they did. The deaths went down like immediately after. So it's they weren't just saying it for PR.
Oh, okay.
Mandela is kind of an interesting person to, I say interesting, I'll say questionable person to invoke if you're like strictly anti-Zionist, because Mandela himself never identified as a Zionist, but he absolutely, whether that be because of just practical considerations or sort of just like a support for the state of Israel broadly or whatever, but he came out and said there, I mean, you can find a quote. I found a quote from him in 1999. Israel had occupied some land in Lebanon, I think. And there was a question about like whether or not Israel would cede that territory and with.
I feel so Jewish when I listen to Lonerbox. What? How? Why?
Draw. And you can find a quote from it in 1990. Okay. Again, this is like
I'm not going to question
well
that.
into the conflict at this point. And he basically says that it's reasonable that Israel would hang on to that land until they got assurances from the neighboring Arab countries that they wouldn't try to attack or invade. He stressed, I mean, he was a stalwart supporter of the PLO and
what are you Jewish? Got him.
The general like cause of Palestinian
I hope YouTube doesn't like recognize my edgy jokes because I tell a lot of my jokes are super anti-Semitic, but obviously it's very clear that they're edgy and I'm not actually anti-Semitic, but I'm really hoping YouTube doesn't like actually YouTube doesn't actually hit me on the head for thinking that I'm an actual neo-Nazi or something or whatever, because I'm not. Because in that debate with the Dickers, when I was saying that, oh, you look like a Jew, you look at your curly hair, you look like a Jew, look at you, you're a Jew. Like, okay.
But
all right.
He at no point said that he was open to a one-state solution, as far as I'm aware, and at no point did he say that Israel didn't have a right to, in his own words, be secure within their own borders.
He also went further. I think in 1993, one of his speeches was about literally supporting Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, like the legitimacy of Zionism and Israel as a Jewish state. He even affirmed that. So, right. Yeah.
Well, a lot of like civil rights leaders.
Yeah, Nelson Mandela glazed Israel in a speech, which is interesting. Okay.
In the United States, for example, they sympathize with the Jewish plight. Like Rosa
as well, right? Yeah.
Rosa Parks, MLK, yeah, they identified with like Jewish persecution and they backed Israel. Like, pretty sure both Rosa Parks,
Martin Luther King too.
And Martin Luther King were like, they were definitely self-avowed Zionists.
Nick Fuentes.
But anyways, like the other. Well, anyway, I wanted to circle back to like, so when you find yourself on the receiving end of this sort of like mob, this angry mob, what do you do? Do you not look at Twitter for a little bit? Do you sort of swim in it? How do you decide when you're going to engage?
I just antagonize them more. I don't know. Depends. Depends on what mood I'm in. It's pretty random. Okay. I don't. Yeah, it's for me. It's not that hard for me to opt out of it because, like, there are other things in life that I like doing as well as fighting.
Well, yeah, and you have your own audience. Like, if you have your own audience that like who you are too, that also helps. All right. Look, it's yeah.
Playing with crazy people. So, and I'm kind of in a position now where, like, I don't know, like sometimes I will just like deliberately throw out like edgy claims, like just because I kind of want to excise this kind of people from my community. And I've been very like over the last 1 or 2 years, I've just been very, very relentless in making sure that kind of like, there are typical.
Lonerbox can do the vetting for me, okay? I'm too lazy to vet like that, so that's exactly why. Listen, that's exactly why I'm trying to attract his viewers, okay?
Typical like behavior patterns that I notice, and they happen on right wingers as well, but like that I just look out for and just purge like as quickly as possible because I don't want these people. I don't like them in my community. I don't want them like trying to sway me. I just don't want to be involved with them really, apart from as like antagonists. So yeah, I'm okay with that. But yeah, it's just like depends on whether I'm up for getting into the stress or not, rolling in the mud. The thing with Mandela, I was going to say as well, is like, you ever heard of a concept called idol grabbing?
No.
There's this thing where ideologues will fight over popular figures from history and just kind of summarize all of their worldviews down to this little post-it note to use them to validate the things that they support now. So like
the letter from the Birmingham jail for MLK or whatever.
Everyone, so right-wingers do it and left-wingers do it with MLK, right? Even though MLK was probably like dem sock dem.
That's
like,
right.
He wasn't any further than that. They do it with Mandela, which it's very easy to do with Mandela because Mandela was an incredible statesman. He was friends with everyone, right? So
yeah, like what these lefties do is that they like digging up the dead, okay? These people are grave robbers, okay? They are grave robbers. They like digging up the dead, okay? They don't want to actually let these people roll around in their graves, okay, in their coffins, because they are the ones that's digging them up.
He would say all these things about Zionism and Israel, very supportive, but at the same time, he would also be very friendly with people who wanted to destroy Israel, right? He would actually spend quite a lot of time hanging out with not just PLO people, because they were kind of different back then, but this was like, he would even go along with like PFLP types or friendly relations with the FLN. But he was also very friendly with the Queen, like on first name terms with the Queen. Not many people were. So,
really?
So yeah, that's why people will just try to take whatever like minutia from people like that and seize it for themselves.
Yeah.
Which is again like the fact is that if Mandela were actually saying the things back then that he says now, he would be seen as like a shit lib. Yeah, he would be.
Right. Yeah.
People, it's easier to claim someone in death than it is when they're still talking, you know?
Yeah, if Twitter was the thing.
Words in their mouths. Yeah.
I remember Ethan saying, let's dig him and ask him. Yeah, that's, yeah. Yep, pretty much. So stupid, dude. Dude, man, leftists really like throwing around dead corpses. Like they even like throwing around Norm Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky, who are both like walking zombies. These people are really obsessed with boomers, dude. If you ever want a generation that's okay with boomers and really like boomers, just get them, okay? Like they're really on board with that shit, dude.
If Twitter was a thing when Mandela was alive or MLK, this group of people that we're speaking about now, this like kind of toxic element on the left, they would savage both of these characters. Like MLK Jr. is a really good example of, what did you call it? Idol grabbing?
Yes. Yeah.
So like, obviously, right wingers will cite his, I have a dream speech where people are judged by the content of the character, not the color of their skin or whatever. They'll cite that as saying, see, even MLK was against identity politics. Meanwhile, he was like fully advocating for reparations and, these sorts of things. And then lefties will point for sure the number one thing that they point to for.
Well, they never liked the idea of a hero who is dead, who is like a moderate, when really, in reality, a lot of these like memorable people are kind of moderates. Yeah, like they weren't extremes. They weren't radical. The fact that they weren't radical in the first place is how they managed to galvanize a whole population of people, right? It's almost like it's almost like a walking contradiction when it comes to these lefties, right? Because they want somebody who can be radical, but the fact that they are even famous in the first place goes to show that they weren't radical when they made these beliefs or attracted these people, right? It's a requirement to not be radical when you're trying to lead a movement with peace, right? Because when you're radical, like radical to the right or to the left, you are, in essence, like any other shitlord who is trying to profit off of conflicts and violence and shit, right? Like, yeah.
For MLK is the letter from the Birmingham jail when he mentions, white moderates and sort of the kind of obstacle that they posed to the civil rights struggle. But if you actually read the letter, and it's not that long, the letter from the Birmingham jail is like 5 pages, takes like 15 minutes to read. He was very specifically, he was kind of speaking in generalities, but he was referencing there was a group of like white pastors that were in the southern states that were complaining that he was doing too much agitating. And so he was specifically responding to them, even though he was speaking in generalities. And in the same letter, I don't know if you know this, in the same letter, in a separate area, he talks about how they had a planned protest in one of the states, like Alabama, I'll just make it up, and a runoff election was scheduled at the same time as their planned protest. And he talked about...
They delayed it so they didn't want to disrupt the election, right?
Right. MLK Jr. in the letter from the Birmingham jail was stressing the importance in engaging directly in electoral politics, voting, taking elections seriously. And I find it quite amusing and ironic that the same people that are making the case that, we need to break away from the Democratic Party and we shouldn't vote for Kamala, blah, blah, blah. These are the same people that cite MLK Jr. But MLK Jr. was like, he was smart enough to understand that you have to claw away at power inch by inch. Like you can't just like cede all this ground to conservatives in government because it would make your job harder. Just feel like that.
Dude, whenever Loki starts saying my name, some shit is about to go down, dude. All I know is that whenever Loki does something like this, some shit is about to go down. If this guy was a white moderate in the southern states, I bet he would have said, fuck milk, let's house him. Moderate is relative. Moderate is relative, but I guess I'm just trying to make a point, right? When I use the word moderate, I'm trying to make a point that you try to appeal towards the moderate of your specific group, so then you can lead a movement of peace, right? Yeah. Why did you blast these Randy jokes surrounding the revenge porn pick convo? Because I can.
That one always sticks out to me. Like it's funny you mentioned that, but because you're absolutely right. It's like both the left and the right just completely bastardize MLK Jr. for their own like cynical purposes.
It's everything about it. Like, because I think with both him and Mandela, the more I read about them, it's like, they're both so much more like intelligent and mindful than any of their the people who invoke them give them credit for, right? Because when you're looking through Birmingham jail and like, even I thought like MLK was just like some brave dude who was good at like a pastor, like a goofy Christian talking about peace and dreams and equality and all that, and then like it was just like he was like a good speech like figurehead, right? And that's all I thought.
Oh, he was a calculated guy.
Jail and all that. Yeah,
Trump
it's super calculated and it's very you can tell he's like thought everything from like down to the basic morality to the means to the ends. Like it's all very, very well thought out, so that to the point where even in Birmingham jail, where he's talking about how they would have these self-purification sessions where they would talk about showing people like how to, if you're going to go to a protest, you have to make sure that you can, like, if you're going to stand on the outside, you have to know that you might have to take blows from the cops and not retaliate, because if you retaliate, it's going to look like a fight, not like oppression. And if you and making sure to have like the well-trained people on the outside or the veterans on the outside because they can absorb blows, or making sure to search people for weapons, and knowing to go to the right states where you know that the police are actually going to ruffle you up. Because I think when they went to Albany in Georgia, the cops there they were rabid segregationists, but the police chief was clever.
No, they're complaining about lefties right now. I don't know where you're getting this interpretation of Trump. Yeah, they're talking about lefties right now, okay?
Enough not to antagonize the protesters too much because they didn't want to make a spectacle of it. So basically you just had protests.
I think I just got just the way you're saying two wrongs don't make a right. Just be careful because sides are cut. Holy war are fervent around some parts. Oh, like it's not okay to do some terrorism in order to get a point forward, or wait, what are you referring to? I'm so confused.
Like protesters marching, but the cops just kind of like gently arresting some of them, guiding the protests into quieter areas, and then nothing came from it. But when they went to Birmingham, it was Birmingham where it was Bull Connor. Was that where he was? The Dixiecrat, the cop?
I'm not sure.
I think it was. Where that guy was like, he was a nutcase. He was really violent, and that's where they got all the media attention. So.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, people just don't really give these guys any credit. They just use them to justify whatever nonsense they were going to support anyway.
Yeah, they were the non.
Yeah, it's like it basically is swinging around like a dead corpse, right? Like, is it not? And honestly, that's also why what's so disgusting about these people, right? And we're not going to finish this talk. We're not going to finish this talk, but I just want to conclude by saying this, okay? I just want to conclude by saying this. There's only one group of people that's more disgusting than people who's trying to lambast these people outright, okay? There's only one group of people who's more disgusting than people who's been trying who actively dislike Martin Luther King, openly dislike Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and all these, and Nelson Mandela, okay? That group of people are people who weaponize their dead corpse, okay? It's people who do perceive these people as good, but they mostly perceive them as tools. All right? Understand that part, okay? It's never about whether you find them to be good or bad, because you can. You're allowed to find these kinds of people good or bad. The point here is how you interpret them. A misinterpretation that leads to a weaponization of their dead bodies is what ultimately leads to bad outcomes, okay? All right? If you're going to be using their dead corpse, like, you better get the facts right at the very least, right? You better know what the full picture is before you actually go out and do something crazy. Yeah, and I'll just leave it there, really.